The sky over Normandy had never looked so blue. But for Lieutenant Jack "Iron Hand" Harris, it might as well have been a tunnel straight to hell. It was July 1944, just weeks after D-Day, and Harris was flying a high-altitude escort patrol in his P-47 Thunderbolt, a juggernaut of a fighter known more for brute strength than grace. Below, a formation of B-17 seconds droned along, loaded with the promise of destruction for German supply lines. All was quiet, until it wasn't, crackling through the radio. "Bandits! High and fast! Coming in hot, it's jets." The Me-262 seconds, the dreaded silver streaks of the Luftwaffe, had entered the battlefield. Faster, sleeker, and deadlier than anything in the Allied inventory. One jet had locked onto Harris, diving in from above like a blade of lightning. He had seconds. Powering away was pointless. The jet would close the gap in less than 10 seconds. Turning meant exposing his belly. Climbing was suicide. But then Harris did something no pilot had dared before he killed his engine. In one motion, he cut the mixture, pulled his prop control to idle, and pointed his nose straight at the earth. The propeller stopped cold. Wind screamed over the canopy. Altitude vanished like smoke. His P-47 was now a 10-ton brick falling from the sky fast. Behind him, the Me-262 followed, sensing an easy kill. But then something impossible happened. The P-47 didn't disintegrate under the strain. It didn't stall or spiral. It rocketed. Without engine drag, with gravity behind it and air resistance plummeting, the Thunderbolt surged past 560 miles per hour. For a few heartbeats, it became the fastest object in the sky, jet included. The German pilot tried to keep up and failed. His airframe began to shake. Control surfaces fluttered. His engines surged against airflow they weren't designed to handle. He backed off, pulled up, and vanished. Harris didn't die. He restarted his engine mid-dive, leveled out near treetop level, and returned to formation silent, alive, and changed forever. That day, the impossible happened. A prop plane, using a move no manual ever endorsed, had outflown a jet in its own element. And it all started with what everyone thought was a mistake. Cutting the engine. Welcome to the story of the dead prop dive. Before he ever touched a cockpit, Jack Harris was already infamous in the hangars of RAF Debden. At just 22, the lanky Californian had the kind of mechanical intuition that made older crew chiefs nervous. He didn't just fly the P-47, he understood it, down to every bolt, pressure line, and intake vibration. Pilots called him Iron Hand, not just because of how he flew, but because if something on his Thunderbolt rattled, whined, or vibrated oddly, he'd fix it himself. Harris came up through the dusty back roads of Bakersfield, wrenching on jalopies in his family's garage. By the time he joined the Army Air Forces in 1942, he was rebuilding carburetors blindfolded and fabricating intake manifolds from scrap. Where most pilots learned to fly and left maintenance to the ground crews, Harris spent his evenings elbow deep in his own power plant, a rare sight in a world where most officers never touched a wrench. This obsession with machinery turned into his secret weapon. Harris developed a gut-level sense of how air, fuel, and metal danced under pressure. He modified the cowling on his jug for better airflow. He rerouted his oil line slightly to optimize cooling. He'd even shaved a pound off his control assembly just by trimming a bracket no one else noticed. While most pilots were praying their birds would get them home, Harris knew his would because he'd made it better. But it wasn't just his modifications that made him a legend, it was his attitude. He challenged doctrine constantly. If the manual said, "Never do X," Jack would find a way to do X safely and faster. His instructors hated him, but his results spoke for themselves. He broke speed records during low-level training runs. He once pulled a split S at such a tight radius. Engineers had to check his wings for stress fractures and found none. So when he told his crew he had an idea to test what happened if he ever killed his prop mid-dive, they called him insane. "You'll stall," they said. "You'll shred the fuselage." But Harris wasn't reckless. He was calculated. He understood drag, compression, wind flow. and he suspected that in a fight against jets, the only way to win might be to fall faster than physics wanted him to. Everyone laughed. Then came July over Normandy, and no one was laughing anymore. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Normandy had become something else entirely. Allied air superiority had been largely uncontested during the early waves of D-Day, with P-47 seconds, P-51 seconds, and Spitfires dominating the skies over the beaches and inland. But then came the shift, and the shape of war changed with it. The Germans had begun deploying their newest terror, the Messerschmitt, Me-262. It wasn't just another plane. It was a jet. Twin engines, swept wings, and a top speed that left even the fastest Mustangs struggling to keep pace. American pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. One moment you'd have radar confirmation. The next, it would vanish, streaking past at nearly 540 miles per hour before you could even react. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was survival. The Me-262 didn't engage in dogfights like traditional Luftwaffe fighters. They struck fast, picked off bombers from extreme distance, then vanished like phantoms. P-47 seconds were tough tanks with wings, but they weren't built for raw speed. The Jug had bulk, weight, and a massive radial engine that thrived at high altitudes. But down low, where jets hunted, the Thunderbolt was outclassed. The kill ratios started shifting. Veteran pilots were scrambling for answers, and no one had one. Command meetings became desperate. Some brass called for new aircraft types to be rushed in. Others ordered tighter escort patterns. But nothing worked. Jets would punch through, kill, and disappear before the Jugs even had a firing solution. Intercept missions became suicide runs. Pilots reported that engaging a 262 was like trying to swat a bullet mid-flight. But then Jack Harris came forward, and his reputation preceded him. He didn't walk into the war room with charts or plans. He just said 7 words that chilled every officer in the room. "What if I kill the engine mid-dive?" They laughed, of course. Some even thought he was joking. But Harris wasn't grinning. He'd spent weeks studying airflow under combat conditions, using flight logs, engine test data, and his own in-air experiments. And he had a theory that a dead prop dive, if done right, could remove so much drag it might let a P-47 outpace even a jet in a straight-down, no-throttle plummet. It was insane. It was reckless. But given how desperate things had gotten over Normandy, they gave him a green light. One mission, one test, one chance. And what happened next would make air combat history. Jack Harris knew he had one shot. If he messed this up, if he misjudged airspeed, altitude, or prop behavior, his P-47 would become a 10-ton lawn dart. But to him, this wasn't insanity. It was math, physics, and desperation converging into a single high-speed hypothesis. He called it the dead prop dive. The core idea was simple, but dangerous. In a standard dive, the propeller, even at low throttle, creates wind resistance. It acts like a brake, but if you completely shut down the engine, the prop stops spinning. And that means the nose of the plane cuts through the air with minimum drag. Combine that with the weight and aerodynamic density of the P-47, and Harris theorized it would hit speeds never before recorded by a piston-engine fighter. But there were problems. First, restarting the engine mid-dive. No one had ever tried that at high G-load and terminal velocity. If it failed, Harris would die before he ever reached 5,000 feet. Second, the P-47's structure wasn't designed to sustain the kind of pressure a vertical dive at 500+ mph could inflict. Wings could shear off, control surfaces could fail, and if the tail went into flutter, he'd break apart like a tin can in a tornado. Still, Harris wasn't backing down. His plan was detailed to the second. Takeoff would be normal. He'd climb to 25,000 feet, enter a shallow descent near known Me-262 flight corridors, and bait a jet to follow. If it happened, he'd throttle to idle, cut the magnetos, and let the prop windmill to a stop. Once in the dive, He'd hold steady until 9,000 feet. Then, and only then, attempt a full-power restart using the backup ignition system. Most pilots couldn't even think clearly at that speed. But Harris had drilled for this. He knew the P-47 better than anyone alive, its control surfaces, its quirks, its limits. The morning of the mission, his crew chief begged him not to go. "This isn't heroism," the man said. "It's suicide with paperwork." But Harris just smiled, patted the Thunderbolt's engine cowling, and whispered, "She's got one more surprise in her." At 0700 hours, Jack Harris taxied out onto a cold French airstrip under thick gunmetal skies. No formation, no escort, just him, the jug, and a theory that could either save the squadron or end in a crater. As his wheels lifted off the runway, Harris muttered under his breath, "Time to race the devil." At 25,000 feet, the world looks different. The clouds hang like frozen oceans, and the sun pierces through with an eerie calm that belies the chaos that brews just out of sight. Jack Harris leveled off, scanning the skies for movement. The P-47 rumbled steadily beneath him, every bolt and plate humming with pent-up energy. He was alone, far from base, and deep within territory that Luftwaffe jets routinely prowled. His heartbeat, though measured, thudded like a war drum in his ears. He wasn't here by chance. Intelligence had tracked a high-speed Mi-262 patrol that passed through this corridor every morning like clockwork. Harris had studied their patterns for days. The German jets, fast and sleek, liked to enter from the northeast, cut a wide arc, and return to base in tight formation. Most Allied pilots avoided this sector entirely, too exposed, too fast, too deadly. But Harris didn't want to avoid them. He wanted their attention. As he reached his target altitude, he flicked switches on the dashboard not for combat, but for his wild gamble. Engine magnetos were hot, fuel pressure steady, everything was checked, double-checked. The cockpit smelled faintly of oil and sweat. A small piece of tape on the dash read, 9,000 feet, restart or die. Harris had scrawled it himself the night before. He throttled back slightly and adjusted trim. The jug's engine growled but obeyed. Then, to his left a flicker, just a shadow at first. But it moved too fast, too smooth to be anything but German. 3 Mi-262 seconds entered the kill zone, slicing through the sky in tight formation. Their silver bodies shimmered in the sunlight, turbines roaring faintly even from miles away. Harris didn't flinch. Instead, he gently nudged the stick forward and throttled down to idle. The P-47 began to sink, slowly at first. He didn't want to spook them, not yet. Then came the bait. He triggered a short burst from his wing guns, not to hit anything, but to make noise, to be seen. The flash of tracers in the thin air was unmistakable. The Mi-262 seconds reacted instantly, banking toward him like sharks scenting blood. Harris watched them curve into pursuit. That was the signal. He cut the magnetos. The propeller slowed, then stopped. Instantly, the noise changed. The engine went silent, leaving only the scream of air over the canopy and the sharp whistle of wind resistance falling away. Harris tightened his grip. The P-47 nosed over and began to dive. This was it, the moment his life's knowledge and death-defying gamble collided. There was no more backup, no more margin, just gravity, pressure, and faith in a dying machine. Behind him, the jets gave chase. Confused at first, then increasingly aggressive. Their pilots saw an easy kill, a P-47 out of position, possibly disabled. They throttled forward, engines shrieking, unaware they were being lured into a trap with no bottom. At 20,000 feet, the dive began to steepen. At 15,000, the fuselage began to tremble. At 12,000, the canopy glass buzzed like it might crack. At 10,000, Harris's vision began to blur from the G-force. But he held it steady. One hand on the stick, one eye on the altimeter. He crossed 9,000. Time to see if this bird would sing or explode. The altimeter spun like a clock on fast forward. Jack Harris felt the raw pull of gravity as the P-47 plummeted through the sky, silent, still, but surging forward like a missile. Behind him, the Me-262 pilots grinned in anticipation. To them, this was over. A dead-prop Thunderbolt tumbling out of control? Easy prey. They began to position themselves for the kill shot. Confident they would be painting a swastika on their fuselage before the hour was out. But Harris had other plans. At 8,900 feet, he reached down and slammed the magnetos back on. The engine coughed. Once, twice. Then came a shudder that rattled the entire frame, and the P-47 roared back to life with a thunderclap so sudden, so violent, it startled even Jack. The massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine didn't just restart. It ignited with vengeance. Flames spit from the exhaust ports. The propeller surged forward, like it had been waiting for permission. Instantly, the aircraft jerked. Nose up. Power on. And then, raw speed. The dive had supercharged everything. With the engine reignited mid-fall, the P-47 converted its gravity-fed descent into pure horizontal velocity. At that altitude, with that mass and boost, Harris was now flying faster than the specs said he could. Way faster. Radar back at base would later calculate it 540 miles per hour, and climbing. And the Me-262 seconds? They weren't ready. The German pilots had never seen a Thunderbolt move like this. One blink, it was falling out of the sky. The next, it was a blur rocketing beneath them and pulling away horizontally. Their jets, designed to dominate the climb and outrun anything in the European skies, were suddenly trailing behind a propeller-driven beast cobbled together with sweat, spare parts, and sheer lunacy. One of them panicked and broke left. Another tried to dive and catch Harris from below. The third attempted to bank hard and loop back into position. But all of them failed. Harris's maneuver hadn't just bought him distance, it had given him dominance. His sudden burst from 0 to supersonic-like speed created chaos in the formation. And he wasn't done yet. With the throttle wide open, he tilted the jug into a low arc, using the residual momentum from the dive to slingshot himself toward the coast. Every muscle in his arms strained against the stick. The wind resistance was brutal now. The Thunderbolt had never been meant to go this fast. The canopy vibrated. The engine ran hot. Oil pressure flickered. But Harris didn't back off. He glanced back. Two of the Me-262 seconds had completely lost visual. The third was still pursuing, but barely. The gap was increasing by the second. The German pilot fired a few desperate bursts, but the rounds fell hopelessly behind. Harris banked right, kissed the treetops, and then rose slightly, leveling off just above the deck, where radar couldn't find him. This wasn't just a tactical escape. It was psychological warfare. When Harris finally crossed back into Allied airspace and landed, the crew chief ran up, pale-faced and breathless. "Sir, what the hell happened to your engine?" he asked, staring at the scorched, cowling, and melted panel seams. Jack Harris just grinned. "It went quiet long enough to listen," he said. Then it screamed. Tu-tu-tu. The dead-prop dive, once thought suicidal, became legend. Harris had done what no one believed possible. Weaponized gravity, flipped death into propulsion, and made a P-47 do what even jets couldn't. And all of it had started with a single idea. Kill the engine. Let the sky decide. When Jack Harris taxied the P-47 into the dispersal bay, silence fell over the airfield. Not the calm kind, but the stunned silence of disbelief. Ground crews stared wide-eyed. Mechanics dropped tools. The man had just returned from deep enemy territory, engine scorched, canopy singed, and airframe creaking like it had been shot out of a cannon. And yet, not a single bullet hole. It was unheard of. A squadron captain approached slowly, eyes locked on the fuselage, still steaming from heat stress. "You hit a dive, lost your engine. And then what outran a Messerschmitt jet? With a dead prop?" His voice was equal parts amazement and suspicion. Harris unstrapped himself and slid down the side of the jug, boots thumping the ground. "More like they outran themselves," he said with a smirk. "I just didn't stop falling until I started flying." The maintenance chief knelt by the intake, running a hand over the scorched paneling. The paint had blistered clean off. Inside, the exhaust manifold was nearly glowing, a leftover symptom of a restart under gravitational overspeed. "This thing should have blown to pieces," he muttered. "You bypassed the boost, Governor, didn't you?" Jack said nothing. The squadron intel officer arrived minutes later, waving a fresh report from Radar Command. "We clocked you at 540 miles per hour. With drag corrections, maybe 555. That's damn near supersonic for a prop fighter." And then came the real silence. That number shouldn't have been possible. Not with a Thunderbolt, not without boost, and definitely not in a falling dive with the prop feathered. But the numbers didn't lie. Somewhere between altitude, aerodynamic terror, and guts, Harris had tapped into something that no manual covered. Command brass wanted answers. Within hours, Harris was summoned to a debrief tent, where a panel of officers, engineers, and operations analysts grilled him over every second of the flight. How did he time the dive? What instruments did he monitor? At what altitude did he restart the engine? Had he tested this before? Was this part of some unauthorized trial? He answered the questions with a calm that made some uncomfortable. No tests, no trial. Just math, guts, and a busted altimeter. The intelligence officer, a man who usually read enemy codes and tracked U-boat movements, leaned in. "You realize you just pulled off something not even jet jockeys can do on command, right? You fell, but in such a way that you created energy. You turned descent into escape velocity. You broke aerial logic." Harris nodded slowly. "Or maybe," he said, "the sky just makes its own rules. I just got out of the way." Back in the hangar, engineers were already gathering around the battered Thunderbolt. They took notes, measured heat deformation, checked engine wear and stress fractures. The aircraft had survived, but barely. The tolerances had been pushed to the edge of structural integrity. Had Harris pulled the restart even a second later, the engine could have locked. A second earlier, and the torque spike might have cracked the crankshaft. But he hadn't just survived. He'd changed the paradigm. Suddenly, other pilots were whispering. Could the dead prop dive be repeated? Could they use it to bait jets into dives they couldn't recover from? Could Thunderbolts, with the right pilot and a heavy enough drop, challenge the rule of jet superiority? The very idea sparked something. It wasn't just about Harris anymore. It was about what else they'd been missing. What other impossible flight tricks lay buried in the margins of aircraft design and raw courage? What other combat theories had been laughed off until someone proved them midair? The legend of the dead prop dive was only beginning. And the war had just discovered a new kind of weapon, not a machine, but a mindset. Within days, Harris's story spread like wildfire, not just across his base, but throughout Allied airfields across Europe. What had once been dismissed as a desperate stunt became a subject of technical fascination and quiet awe. For weeks, mimeographed mission reports containing flight metrics from his dive were passed between squadrons. Engineers annotated the margins. Instructors at fighter school detachments started referencing the Harris dive as a case study in applied aerodynamics under duress. But not everyone was convinced. Some senior officers were deeply skeptical. One British observer called it reckless bravado disguised as innovation. A few suggested Harris should be grounded for testing unapproved maneuvers mid-combat. Yet even they couldn't argue with the radar logs, or the fact that Harris had come back alive, or that the Me 262 seconds hadn't. Flight commanders began quietly introducing the core concepts of the dead prop dive into tactical briefings. Not as a formal maneuver, but as a last-ditch option, something a pilot might try when all else failed. The kind of trick that wasn't written in any manual, but might save your life when the sky went silent and the enemy was faster, meaner, and right on your tail. Meanwhile, engineers at Wright Field and Eglin AFB requested detailed reports. They wanted to reconstruct the conditions of Harris's dive altitude, temperature, engine response curves, drag coefficients. Could they replicate it in simulations? What were the structural limits? How did the airflow behave around a feathered prop at terminal velocity? The data painted a fascinating picture. Under specific conditions, high altitude, steep dive, controlled feathering, and timed restart, a P-47 could generate a thrust vector on restart that, coupled with dive momentum, created a temporary burst of velocity beyond its rated limits. Essentially, the aircraft skipped forward, riding the edge of stall and shockwave just long enough to escape. Pilots started experimenting. Not openly, of course, but during ferry runs or solo training loops, some began practicing controlled dives, easing the prop pitch to 0, logging how long the engine could stay quiet before choking. Some got scared, others got curious. One pilot over France accidentally triggered a reverse thrust burst at 18,000 feet and tore a chunk of his cowling off. He landed safely. His report could be something here. Wouldn't recommend without a full bladder. By month's end, Harris was unofficially debriefed by a stateside intelligence officer who'd flown in just for him. "You realize you've created a precedent," the officer said. "Your name's in 6 field reports. You're being cited at briefings in the Pacific. They're calling you the guy who outran a jet with a broken plane." But Harris shrugged. "I wasn't trying to break anything," he said. "I just didn't want to die that day." Still, his flight data would go on to influence not just combat doctrine but jet transition programs. When early jet pilots struggled with glide angles and flameouts, instructors quietly pointed to the Harris case. If a guy in a Thunderbolt can restart a stalled engine while falling at 500 miles per hour, maybe you can figure out how to land a jet without panicking. Eventually, someone asked Harris if he'd ever do it again. He smiled. "Only if someone else is paying for the engine." But the truth was, his one desperate gamble had shifted the perception of what air combat could be. It blurred the lines between mechanics and instinct, between physics and fury. In an era dominated by engines, it was a pilot who found a way to weaponize gravity and lived to tell the tale. The Harris dive wasn't just legend anymore. It was becoming lore. As the Harris dive spread beyond the whispers of hangar talk into the written evaluations of air doctrine, it began influencing more than just the way P-47 pilots thought about their aircraft. Across the Allied air forces, engineers, tacticians, and even aircraft designers began revisiting assumptions they had long held as gospel. What began as one man's instinctive survival maneuver was now being dissected, analyzed, and adapted into something far more significant. Flight instructors at P-47 transition schools started introducing optional sessions on emergency energy management during dives. Though they couldn't officially include prop feather and restart in the curriculum, they encouraged students to discuss and understand the mechanics behind it. Some even ran mock scenarios during simulations, guiding rookies through dive escape procedures where traditional thrust was unavailable. Harris's name was now spoken not just in awe, but in footnotes of flight manuals. The Air Materiel Command quietly commissioned wind tunnel tests to explore the airflow characteristics of the P-47 during steep, high-speed dives. Their findings? While the aircraft's original design hadn't accounted for feathered prop-induced surge acceleration, it nonetheless proved structurally resilient, even at velocities 12–18% beyond its rated limits. More interestingly, they discovered that the very elements most engineers had thought of as design flaws, its broad fuselage, massive turbo supercharger system, and thick radial engine, created a surprisingly stable platform for brief bursts of extreme dive performance. The plane could, under just the right conditions, not only survive the dive, but weaponize it. Other squadrons attempted to replicate the Harris dive under controlled conditions. A few found success. Most didn't, because what Harris did couldn't be reduced to charts and diagrams. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about timing, guts, and a rare kind of airborne intuition. Still, even failed attempts proved informative. Engineers modified emergency procedures for both radial and inline engine fighters. They drafted fallback recommendations for prop feathering in non-combat scenarios. Jet programs reviewed these notes as they began developing glide restart protocols. And as for Harris, he was rotated stateside 6 weeks later, partially to preserve the pilot who had become something of a legend, and partially because command feared the kind of copycat dives younger pilots might attempt trying to prove they could do it too. On his first day back, he walked into a debriefing room to find a dozen instructors waiting not to interrogate him, but to ask him to teach. So he did. In the months that followed, Harris helped draft a series of emergency air maneuver exercises for both prop and early jet pilots. He emphasized mental rehearsal. When everything goes quiet, you've already lost 3 seconds. Thinking. Don't waste a fourth wondering. He taught power curve awareness, energy trading, and more subtly, the art of trusting instinct when numbers failed. He was also asked to contribute to an emerging post-war study, energy management in asymmetric dogfights. His dive was used as the closing case study proof that with enough airspace, the right configuration, and sheer will, even a propeller-driven fighter could escape a jet. Back at his old squadron, his fellow pilots painted a small icon under his cockpit before he left a feathered prop plunging through a thundercloud with lightning bolts on either side. They called it the dive badge. It wasn't official, but it caught on. Even decades later, during interviews for documentaries and oral histories, pilots would recall the Harris dive as the moment they realized aircraft limits weren't just about machines but about people willing to push them. Some said it reminded them of why they flew. Others admitted it scared the hell out of them. And in every air show, every air museum, and every dusty hangar where the story was told, someone would lean forward and whisper, "You know the Harris story, right? The guy who turned his dead engine into a slingshot?" Because by then, Harris wasn't just a pilot. He was the guy who proved that even when the engine stops, the fight isn't over if you know how to fall faster than fear. The Harris dive might have begun as an instinctive act of desperation, but its implications would echo far beyond the skies over Normandy. What one pilot had done in mere seconds changed how an entire generation of aviators thought about performance, limits, and the idea of what a machine and a man could do when cornered. And long after the war, its legacy would shape doctrine, design, and belief. In the years following World War II, air combat rapidly evolved. Jet propulsion became the new standard. Propeller fighters were gradually retired, and radar-guided missiles replaced the up-close and personal dogfights of the war era. But even in this age of sweeping change, the story of Captain Harris and his thunderous dive lived on not as a relic, but as a parable. In flight schools across the U.S., instructors referenced it as a case study in energy management. They taught young pilots that even if the aircraft was failing, if the odds were impossible, there was always a maneuver left if you had the nerve to try it. More than a few engineers in the post-war aviation industry, including veterans who'd once served in the same command as Harris, found themselves rethinking how airflow, weight distribution, and control surfaces could be optimized for high-speed emergency dives. The Harris dive showed that sometimes what wasn't in the manual could still save your life, and that true performance didn't always come from more power, but from the creative use of the power you had. A declassified 1947 report from the U.S. Air Force titled Non-Conventional Combat Exits and Evasive Protocols listed the Harris incident among its most valuable real-world case studies. It described the dive as a statistically low repeatability maneuver yielding maximum evasive benefit under high-risk duress, but also noted that the decision-making under pressure demonstrated by Harris was of the type that merits formal training exercises in intuitive judgment during simulated systems failure. In other words, they couldn't teach what he did, but they could teach how to think like someone who might one day do it. The P-47 itself, often overshadowed by the more glamorous P-51 Mustang, got a second life in historical narratives thanks to Harris's story. Once regarded as a durable brute of a fighter, It was now also remembered as the aircraft that had allowed one man to weaponize gravity and silence. Veterans who flew the Jug began telling new versions of their stories, emphasizing not just the firepower or armor, but the untapped performance lurking beneath the obvious. Harris, for his part, rarely spoke about the dive in his later years. When pressed in interviews, he'd simply say, "The engine quit, and I didn't want to die," then laugh and change the subject. But pilots who served with him, and younger ones who trained under his guidance in the late 42nds, knew there was more. They said he carried the weight of that moment not as a badge of honor, but as a reminder of just how thin the line between survival and oblivion could be. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a guy who fell smarter than the jet could fly. At air museums today, where children climb into old cockpits and ask about the dials and levers, some docents still tell the Harris story. They point to the throttle quadrant and say, "Imagine killing that engine right here, while plummeting at 20,000 feet, with a jet chasing you and knowing you've got seconds to fix it or die." Most kids nod, not fully grasping it. But some lean in, some ask the right questions, and maybe, just maybe, one of them walks away thinking about what it means to try the impossible, because sometimes the impossible is just an unopened door. In the end, Harris didn't change the world with a dive. He just reminded us that courage isn't always loud, that the best pilots aren't the flashiest ones, and that sometimes all it takes to rewrite the rules of the sky is knowing when to let go.